Security researchers find deep flaws in the CVSS vulnerability scoring system. Now, this is an article that was published by Cybersecurity Organization magazine, an online magazine. And this, who are those security researchers? It's talking about JPMorgan Chase bank security researchers. So they came up with this interesting, interesting report that I want to, discuss about as far as vulnerability management is concerned. Vulnerability management is a specific discipline within cybersecurity. And I am particularly interested in this topic because we have a good number of us have talked about this specific flaw of the CVSS scoring system. Now, I'm going to unpack that as we move forward in this video. But before I delve into unpacking all of this, if you want to be getting free cybersecurity advice, free cybersecurity discussions on topics like this, why don't you like, share, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel? So you just heard me talk about vulnerability. You heard me talk about vulnerability management. So vulnerability management is a specific area, a specific discipline within cybersecurity in every organization. And what is a vulnerability? A vulnerability simply means a flaw, a weakness on software, applications, network, systems, name them. You know, take your phone, look at different applications that you have on your phone or your computer, look at the different software programs that you have on your computer. Now, these software were developed by humans like you and me, software developers, right? In the process of developing this software, they made some mistakes, and in cybersecurity, we call them flaws, we call them vulnerabilities. Now, vulnerabilities have grown over the years, and we now have misconfigurations under the banner of vulnerabilities. So every application that you know of, every piece of IT infrastructure component, whether it's regular IT or information technology, of course, or OT, operational technology, or IoT, Internet of Things, any of these, they all have vulnerabilities. And let me give another example of what you think a vulnerability is like. Think of your home, right? The front door of your home, the door, the door lock has an issue. It's a little bit faulty, right? And an attacker could easily penetrate into your home using that specific fault. So that is a vulnerability. Or take a look at your back window. Your back window is falling off a little bit, that somebody, a thief, could gain unauthorized access into your home. That also is a vulnerability. That is an example, right? And in applications, in software, we also have those kind of vulnerabilities. They are the leeways, the open doors, the means and ways through which an attacker could gain unauthorized access into an application, into a system, a server, or a network. So every vulnerability has an identification number, and that identification number is called the CVE number, Common Vulnerabilities and Exposure ID number. It's just like everybody, right? Everybody has a name. Every vulnerability has this specific number that identifies the vulnerability. So vulnerabilities have different severity levels. While some vulnerabilities have a low severity levels, others have medium, others have highs, and others have criticals. So how do we know these different severity levels? It is because of something called the CVSS scoring system. Who brought about the CVSS scoring system? So the United States Department of Homeland Security, together with many other big tech companies in the security world, came together and formed an organization called the FIRST organization. That organization came up with what we call the CVSS scoring system. CVSS stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System. And this is the scoring system that most organizations have been using, and it is the reason behind this specific publication by security researchers at Chase Bank. And specifically, if I just get a paragraph from that publication, it says the industry-wide method for assessing the severity of vulnerabilities in software and hardware needs to be revised because it provides potential misleading potential misleading assessment. And that is exactly what we've been talking about. But before you understand this thing, so in order to better understand the breakdown of the CVSS scoring system, first of all, I want to explain, right, what is CVSS again? CVSS stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System. And I'm going to be showing you that compressed textual representation of certain metrics and metric values. We're going to break that down of all those metrics and the metric values that tell us it is from these metrics and the metric values that we understand that severity level. We understand the specific characteristics of that software vulnerability. So before we continue, let's take a look at a typical vulnerability. Remember, I said vulnerabilities are denoted, they're identified by a specific unique identifier called CVE ID number. So I'm going to be sharing my screen and we go to the internet and pick at random any CVE, right? So I think the best search that we should be doing at this point is let's look at the newest announced CVE ID, right? Let's look at that. Let me see. I just want to pick anyone. Okay, so we have this, right? So let me search for this specific CVE. And so here we go. When I click on that, that is going to be taking us to the National Vulnerability Database. It's the database that where all software vulnerabilities are archived. So if we come here, and so here is the CVSS. So we are currently on version 4, but most people still use version 3.1. All right, so this is the CVSS. So CVSS again is what tells us the characteristics of that vulnerability, what tells us the severity of that vulnerability. So if you see here, you're going to see some jumble of of letters, right? So, but what does all of this mean, right? These are the different metrics and the metric values. So a typical vulnerability, in order to understand what the severity is, if you look at the CVSS scoring system, so here in this case, if you look at this AV stands for attack vector, right? And then it's followed by a colon. Then you are going to have the different metric values, all right? So we'll get to that. And then we have AC, attack complexity, and then you have colon followed by the metric values, then PR, which stands for privileges required, and you have the metric values. Then you got user interaction, followed by the metric values. Then you have scope, and then followed by the metric values, and then CIA. all followed by the metric values. So here, let's just look at what all of those different metrics and metric values are. At this stage, I'm not going to define them, but in the next stage, in the next few minutes, just bear with me, we're going to be defining all of them. So the first one is attack vector. So attack vector, usually denoted as AV, has metric values of network, adjacent, local, and physical. And attack complexity has metric values as low and high. And then privileges required, PR, has a metric value as low or high. User interaction has metric values as none for N or R for required. Then scope, people don't usually use scope very much, so I'm striking that off. Then you have CIA. They all have metric values as none, low, and high. So let's look at the attack vector. Attack vector simply tells us the pathway, the means through which an attacker could exploit a vulnerability. Let me quickly share my screen again so we can have a more picturesque view. So if you see here, attack vector, again, is denoted as AV. So an attack vector, remember I just said attack vector could be network, it could be adjacent, it could be physical, or it could be local, right? So each time you hear of an attack vector being network, it means that the vulnerability can be exploited over the internet. It could be exploited remotely, which means if you have a vulnerable asset, say in the United States, and somebody is in South Korea or Japan, wherever around the globe, and that the attack vector of that vulnerability is a network, it means in cybersecurity vulnerability management, we call that kind of a vulnerability a remote code execution vulnerability. It means that somebody from around the world can exploit that vulnerability from a distance over the internet. All right. So that is the meaning of attack vector being network. So the next metric value for our metric attack vector is metric value adjacent. It is always denoted as A, where you have AVA. It means that the attack vector for that vulnerability is adjacent. So in this case, it means that the vulnerability can only be exploited from a network that is physically or locally or logically close to the vulnerable system. Here we talk about it could be, over Bluetooth or Wi-Fi and stuff like that. Now let's move to the next one. So our next metric value for attack vector is local. In this case, this means that if you have a vulnerability on an asset, for someone to be able to successfully exploit that vulnerability, they need to be on the same local network as that vulnerable asset. If you have attack vector L, AVL, someone cannot exploit that vulnerability over the internet. They need to be within the local area network of that specific vulnerable asset. And finally, for attack vector, the last metric value that I want us to look at is the metric value of physical. What does this mean? It means that for a vulnerable asset, any vulnerability that has attack vector physical, it means that for an attacker to be able to exploit that vulnerability, they need to have physical access of that specific vulnerable component, that specific vulnerable asset. So if they do not have physical access of that device or of that asset, they are not able to exploit that vulnerability. So again, we've just talked about the first part, the first metric in a CVSS vector string, which is the attack vector. And we said attack vector could either be qualified as network for remote code execution vulnerabilities, for adjacent, for physical and local, right? So those are the qualifiers for all attack vectors. Now, the next metric that I want us to take a look at is the metric value called attack complexity. The next is attack complexity. So for attack complexity, there are two types of metric values. So what is attack complexity? It just simply means how difficult or how easy is it for a specific vulnerability to be exploited. So if the attack complexity is low, it means that it is very easy for that vulnerability to be exploited. It means that it is not difficult for that vulnerability to be exploited. It means that it is script kiddie, or anybody who is just new in pen testing, anybody who is new in cybersecurity may be able to exploit that vulnerability, right? So, but if attack complexity AC is high, it means that it is difficult. It's a very difficult vulnerability to exploit. Then the next metric within the CVSS scoring system is what we call PR, privileges required. Now, what does privileges mean? Privileges mean that do you need to first of all authenticate? Do you need to sign in? Do you need to log into the specific vulnerable component before you are capable of exploiting it? If the answer is yes, then if it is low, it means that you need only the you need only the normal user privileges to be able to exploit that vulnerability. And sorry, I think we have to start with an N. So, but we didn't capture it here. So if it is an N for no, it means that you don't require any privileges at all. The attacker doesn't need to log in. The attacker doesn't need to authenticate into that vulnerable component before they are able to exploit it. Then the next one is a low. It means the attacker needs just simple user privileges to be able to exploit that vulnerability. And then for high, which means it's more difficult, it means that the attacker needs administrative privileges. They need to be an administrator. They need to be a root user of that specific application, of that specific software or system to be able to exploit that vulnerability. Then here we have the next one is user interaction, UI. User interaction simply means that does the attacker need the help of the user of that application, the user of that system, the user of that component before they are able to exploit it? If the answer is, if that user interaction is required, R, it means that the attacker is going to have a hard time trying to exploit that. But if no user interaction is required, then it's easier for an attacker to be able to exploit that vulnerability, right? And in that specific case, when user interaction is not required, then we call that an unauthenticated vulnerability that can be exploited, right? And then just imagine if there is a no here, sorry, there's a network here, it means that if there's a network here and here is also an N, it means that that is an unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerability, which is something that is a little bit serious, right? Then we have confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We did a long discussion about this. So I'm going to be dropping the link for this. For those who have not watched that video, I'm going to be dropping the link that talks about the CIA triad, right? So for all the CIA triad, so those are the impact metrics, which means that if the impact on confidentiality integrity, and availability of that vulnerable component. If they are all high, then take it more seriously, right? If they are known, then you don't need to take that serious, stuff like that. So, but if you don't know about the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, I did a video about this already. So I'm going to be dropping that in the comment section or in the description part of this video. What you have just seen is you have seen a description of what the CVSS scoring system is all about. We saw the different metrics and the metric values that communicate to us the severity and the specific characteristics of vulnerabilities. But now the question is, with all of these put together, and the CVSS score is say like 9 on 10, does that portray actual risk to the environment? That is the argument that we have been making, that severity level is different from risk. So that takes me to the next part that I want to talk about, that explains why the researchers at Chase Bank came up with that publication, that the CVSS scoring system is misleading. All right. So I'm going to quickly share my screen again so we can look at what I call actual risk determination. So first of all, what is risk? Risk is simply the potential for loss, right? And I want you to always look at it this way. Risk is a product of likelihood and impact. Likelihood and impact. What is the likelihood that the attacker is going to exploit the vulnerability in the first place, right? And then if they succeed, what is the potential impact that is going to cost the organization, right? So a number of factors come to play, right, when we're talking about likelihood. Personally, I want to look at, is that vulnerability a remote code execution vulnerability, right? We just talked about RCEs, remote code execution vulnerability, where the attack vector AV is a network, right? So once the attack vector AV is a network, that becomes a remote code execution vulnerability. And then it becomes worse when the attacker doesn't need privileges, right? If privileges are none, and then the user interaction is also none, then it becomes an unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerability. So I want to pay attention to that, right? It means once we have this in place, it means that the likelihood for the exploitation of that vulnerability is something to think about. Then the next thing that I want to think about is the location of the vulnerable product on the network. Yeah, so it is concerning if a specific asset, a specific vulnerable asset, which has a remote code execution vulnerability on it, and an attacker doesn't really need user interaction. An attacker doesn't need any privileges to exploit that vulnerability, and that vulnerability is internet facing. You want to pay attention to that, right? And the next thing that concerns people about the likelihood for that exploitation is, the availability of exploits. Now, let me shock you. Out of, say, 1,000 vulnerabilities, it's just between 3 to 10% that have exploits in the first place. So, which means that like 7,000 out of the 1,000, 700 out of the 1,000 vulnerabilities may never ever get exploited, right? So you want to pay attention to vulnerabilities. You want to prioritize for remediation vulnerabilities that have exploits that are available. And your scanning tools are going to tell you that, right? Vulnerability intelligence will tell you that. So, by the way, those exploits that we're talking about, are they even actively used, right? So if You can have exploits that are not actively used and exploits that are actively used. You want to prioritize those that are actively used. Then you want to also take a look at the population of the vulnerable asset. For example, let's say you have only 5 vulnerable assets, for example, versus say 20,000 vulnerable assets, right? The chances that an attacker, the likelihood that an attacker is going to exploit one of those 20,000 is way higher than when they're going to attack one of the 5, right? Then the next thing, which is extremely important to me, is the security controls that the company has in place. Take, for example, you have a vulnerability that if a code is run, an exploit is executed on a specific server or system, then, it's going to cause that exploitation, okay? And that server or system doesn't have any endpoint detection or response tool on it versus another system that has an endpoint detection and response tool on agent, right? So look at 2 different scenarios, right? So CVSS core says that this vulnerability is a 10 on 10. It gives it a 10 on 10 and they call it critical, right? But if I have an endpoint detection and response agent on a specific server that has a vulnerability that if exploited, my EDR agent is going to block that from executing, then it's not as risky as a situation where you have a server or a system that doesn't have any EDR. Okay, that's where we say the presence of security controls. What security controls do you have to mitigate the exploitation of that specific vulnerability? So that also comes to play. So as a cybersecurity vulnerability management analyst or engineer, these are the kinds of things that goes through your mind while you're thinking of which vulnerabilities should I send for remediation first. And that the CVSS scoring system does not provide. Finally, I want to also take into consideration the asset criticality. How important is this asset to the company? Take, for example, you have an Amazon web server that is vulnerable for a specific remote code execution vulnerability. So of course, the Amazon web server is that technology that powers the Amazon website where you are able to place your orders. It means that that web server is internet facing, right? So you want to make sure that that web server has enough security. Okay, I don't want to go into the nitty gritties of what kind of security controls will be around that. But what I'm saying is the Amazon web server makes for Amazon 1.29 billion US dollars every day. What the Amazon web server gives to Amazon every day is 1.2 billion US dollars. Think about that. So we want to say that that specific asset is very critical to the company, right? Because think of the amount of money that Amazon is going to lose if there were some kind of distributed denial of service attack, a DDoS attack that shuts down all its web servers. So you'll not be able to go online, place orders, and they wouldn't make money. So asset criticality, I don't want to make this video unnecessarily long, but my point is asset criticality is also extremely important. So I'm very, very happy that we are having different security engineers and researchers talking about what some of us have been talking about and what some of us have been practicing already, that the CVSS scoring system is not the gospel of cybersecurity vulnerability management, ratings, right? And that we need to also factor in what the true risk is, and each vulnerability, each vulnerability is unique, and each environment where that vulnerability is found is unique. We have situations where CVSS could say this is a critical severity vulnerability, and I look at it and I give it an automatic low or an automatic moderate, looking at all these factors that we've talked about. All right. So let's take the let's take the rendezvous for next time. I'm going to be dropping more interesting cybersecurity, especially vulnerability management videos. But before you go, I really urge you again to like, subscribe, comment, share our YouTube, this specific video, to like minds, people who like to, talk about this, criticize what I have said. I'm very open to criticism, and, see you again some other time. Bye for now.